Connection is through my daughter Emma, who was diagnosed in 2001 at the age of 14. I'm proud to say that she's engaged to get married in May. She's doing great. Her last A1C was 5.8. Hasn't always been that good, and that's the journey that everybody in this room who's touched by type 1 diabetes knows. It's a roller coaster ride. She's why I'm standing here. She's my inspiration. She's my hero, as virtually all of these young people are who have to deal with this disease, particularly at young ages. When you see 5- and 6-year-old kids dealing with type 1 diabetes, it's extraordinary. They're heroic. They are role models. They mature much earlier and quicker than their peers do, that's for sure. And it's just an inspiration. It's why I love coming to these kinds of events and meeting those kids and their families. I told you the date. Everybody knows the date, right? Everybody knows it. I sometimes stand in front of a room and all I say is April 28, 2001. And everybody knows exactly what that date means to my family. I want to talk a little bit about big picture JDRF, because I think there are newly diagnosed families in the room. Is that right? People who've been relatively new to our organization. Who's relatively new to JDRF, who's been diagnosed in the last 6 months, a year? All right, well, I'm going to make a few high-level comments about the organization and try to be relatively brief so that I don't repeat what people here know. But I will tell you this. For more than 45 years, JDRF has been the only organization in the world dedicated exclusively to funding research to treat, cure, and prevent type 1 diabetes. In that time period, we have directly funded well over $2 billion of research. We continue to operate a research program that's focused on delivering therapies to people that change their lives as quickly as possible as we move along that pathway to curing and preventing this disease. We're going to talk about all those issues in a few minutes. What I can tell you is, having been on the international board now, having worked with many of the volunteers around the country, the level of commitment, the relentless purpose that we bring to this, the strategic approach that JDRF brings to funding research, it's an extraordinary thing to see. Extraordinary to see the level of focus and the way we set the global research agenda. There is virtually nothing that happens in type 1 diabetes research of importance to you and me as a parent that JDRF hasn't touched. Virtually no major research advance, nothing that we're going to talk about today. Nothing that people out there are talking about at the vendor tables. None of that would have happened without the leadership and vision of this organization. So we've got a long way to go, and we'll talk about that. But I saw a sign when I walked in. I don't know why it's on the building. Maybe somebody else knows. It says, "Bet on the rider, not the horse." I don't know if some famous Nebraska person said that. But that's what we're doing. Bet on JDRF, because that's how we're going to drive progress. I will tell you, too, on a personal level, in 2001, when Emma was diagnosed, they told us there'd be a cure in 5 years. Anybody else hear something like that? Right. Now, it wasn't because JDRF was trying to kind of deceive me or anyone else, say, oh, there's going to be a cure, this way you'll give us more money. In fact, back then, there was actually some very exciting stuff going on in terms of transplanting islet cells into people, which people really thought was going to be the cure, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But I'm standing here now, 18 years later, and I am more hopeful, more optimistic, more certain that we are going to move the needle and drive progress and eventually cure this disease than I was 18 years ago when they told us we'd get the job done in 5 years. And I hope when I'm done talking today, you'll understand why I feel that way. These are some numbers, and the one that they talk a little bit about how much we've spent, which I touched on, 150 are the number of grants annually, approximately the award to scientists. 21 countries. We're funding research in 21 countries. We fund the best and the brightest scientists we can find. We're agnostic as to where you live, what state you're in, what city you're in, what country you're in. If you've got the kind of research chops that we're looking for to fill the gaps and drive the progress that we've identified in the areas we're going to talk about, we're interested in funding you. We have more than 20 PhD scientists on our staff right now. When I started with JDRF 18 years ago, we had 2. These are the best and the brightest scientists in the type 1 diabetes community. And every day they come to work and they oversee our grants and they identify opportunities for us to continue to deploy the money you so generously raise and donate to improve our success and our progress. But the most important thing up here is in the upper right-hand corner, 70, which is actually now probably 75. Human clinical trials. If you know anything about how drugs or devices get to the market, they have to be tested in people. You hear a lot about preclinical research. That's studies on animals. That's important. That's part of the work, and we're going to look a little bit about how this sort of product goes from an idea in somebody's head all the way over to being in your hands. But you can't get there without human clinical trials. That's how the rubber hits, that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where you begin to test products to see if they'll work in humans. And it's a long process, takes years, and it's the most expensive part of getting a drug or device to market, by far, is testing it on people. When I started at JDRF, not even when I started, a decade ago, we were funding about 5 to 7 human clinical trials. We're now funding over 70. What does that tell you? Why is that important? What it tells you is that our focus is on delivering transformative therapies to people. We're not about science projects. We're not about, gee, that'd be interesting, wouldn't it? No, we want to focus our dollars and our resources on research that has the potential to land in your hands, in your hands, in your hands, and improve your lives and eventually cure this disease. That is a test of how our focus has changed, because we didn't used to think in those ways. We funded mostly basic research, bench research, scientists at the bench beginning to think of problems and exploring and doing the very basic building blocks of science. We still do a lot of that, and again, we'll talk a little bit about it. But we realized that at some point, we got to start helping people get better. And the focus on human clinical trials, what's called translational research, translating promising discoveries in the lab into a product. That's a big part of what we do now, and that's why we're so optimistic about where we're going. I'm not a fan of this slide because it's also complicated and confusing, but the basic and most important part about this is to realize that it's not just, we can't do it alone. All of you are generous. All around the country where I speak, people donate and raise money for JDRF. But we're raising about we're funding about $100 million of research a year. The problems are bigger than that. We've got to get better, and we are getting better. But we realize strategically, how do we make a dollar that you give us go farther? That's what we call leverage. And actually, this data is probably about over a year old now. And what you can see way up in the other left-hand corner is for every dollar we invest in research now, we're generating $2.50 in additional dollars from foundations, from industry, from governments, to supplement that money, to push the envelope even further. So when you think of donating, realize that it's not just $1 that you're donating, it's at least $2.50. Because we've got to get other people in this space, because we can't do it alone, no matter how successful every gala is. Research is expensive, very expensive. And so finding ways to use the dollars we raise to attract more dollars to this space is critically important. When you think about it, and you realize that if you're a big pharmaceutical company and you could put money into heart disease or cancer research or AIDS or some other disease with tens of millions of patients, and then you have type 1 diabetes, it's huge in our world, but there are only about 1.5 million, 1.25 million people in the United States with type 1 diabetes today. Now, we think those numbers are going up. We know those numbers are going up. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But it's still a very small disease. And if you're running a big pharmaceutical company, you say, well, I got a chance to put money in this heart treatment. which I can sell to tens of millions of people, or I could spend a lot of money to come up with something in type 1. Where are you going to put the money? They're businessmen. They have stockholders. We have to find a way to get those companies in our space. That's what we use leverage for. We use it to de-risk exciting things so that companies are more willing to come in because the risk may be not quite as great as if they were on their own. So it's a very important part of what we do. Wow, this is a fast thing. I talked a little about this pipeline concept, and that's really what we're showing here. If you go left to right with the microscope over there all the way on the left, that's what I was referring to as basic research, bench research, discovery research. It's where all science begins, looking and trying to figure out a problem. Well, if you get that, what good is coming up with something in the lab if you can't actually then go test it on animals to see if it's going to work? That's where we get into this translational research. Translational research has two elements to it. Preclinical, which is animal research, and then human clinical trials. Okay? Well, what good is if it works in animals if we can't test it in humans? We've got to do that too. What good is if it works in humans, but then we can't get the FDA to approve it? That's not good for anybody. What good if the FDA approves it, and then we can't get insurers to cover it? We've accomplished nothing. And what good is it if we get insurers to cover it and we can't get doctors to prescribe it? There are doctors in big cities in this country, not endocrinologists, because most people with type 1 do not see an endocrinologist. There are plenty of primary care physicians in this country who do not even know that a CGM is the gold standard for treating patients with type 1 diabetes. So we can get all this done, but if we can't get them prescribed by doctors, we spent a lot of money on a great product that nobody's ever going to have. That's what we mean when we talk about this pipeline. And JDRF is at every step of this pipeline. We're working and funding scientists doing bench research. I talked about the preclinical and clinical trials we're funding. I've talked about the work we touched on earlier that in the advocacy discussion, in the work we're doing with FDA and NIH. Talked about the CGM history, and ultimately about clinical adoption. That's when you hear people at JDRF say, we work the pipeline. We're not a single issue organization just trying to fund research, because it's got to be everything. All right, now I'm going to start getting to the good stuff. We work in about 5 or 6 different areas of research, and we've kind of clustered them up there in the cure area because, and this all stuff kind of weaves together. I think we're increasingly uncomfortable trying to say we've got different buckets. And again, I'll talk a little bit about why it is, but the reality is that a lot of the things we're doing in our prevention program are directly relevant to curing type 1 diabetes. So we have a work in what we call beta cell restoration, which is a big part of curing type 1, restoring beta cell function. We have beta cell replacement, which again I'll talk about, which is also sort of a form of a cure, and prevention. That's 1 or 3 sets of work. Then we have what we call treat, which is this notion that, great, we've got to drive transformative change, we've got to cure this disease, we've got to prevent this disease, but that's going to take time. That's the reality. It's not around the corner. So we've got to keep people healthy. Because if people, 10 years from now, if there's a cure or another device that makes taking care of this disease safer and easier and less invasive, but in that 10 years you've gotten complications, it's not going to do you any good. We've got to focus not just on long-term curing and preventing this disease, but making sure that everybody who has this disease is increasingly able to take care of it easily, safely, simply, non-invasively, and extremely effectively, so nobody will gasp 10 years from now, 5 years from now, whenever it is, when a speaker stands before you and says, my daughter has an A1C of 5.8. Everybody will say, well, yeah, so does mine. And that's because we're going to get technology introduced and devices and drugs introduced to make that happen. So now let me talk about the various areas of research that we're focused on. Restoration, regeneration, and you see underneath there immune therapies. This is the cure. This is the biological cure. How do you cure type 1 diabetes? You have to do 2 things. You have to stop the destruction of the beta cells, which we know is going on, right? We know there's an immune attack. Cells destroy these beta cells, compromises the body's ability to produce insulin. We've got to reverse that, stop that process. And then we've got to replace all those beta cells that have been under attack, that are hiding, that have disappeared, so that they can come back and function normally without fear of being attacked and destroyed. That's the cure. It sounds pretty simple. Of course, it's not really simple because nobody in the history of medical research has actually ever cured an autoimmune disease. Never been done. That's what we're out trying to do. So here's the exciting part about this. When Emma was diagnosed, they told us she will have no insulin production, no beta cells within 6 months to a year. And I'm looking at young people around here. You probably, if you're sitting in here and you're a young person, I'm guessing you have type 1. And a lot of you were told something similar to that. You have your honeymoon period, and then that's it. Game over. 100% insulin. Well, guess what? Turns out that's wrong. Turns out that people who have had type 1 diabetes for 50 years or longer still have beta cells. Not a lot of them. Some of them are hiding. They're stressed. But we now know something about beta cells that we didn't know a decade ago. We're learning more and more. But that's a huge thing to think about. Because if you thought they were all gone and the cure involved getting them all back in there or restoring function, that's one challenge. But if they're actually there, and there's a way to just restore them to functioning more effectively, that's a bit of a less daunting challenge. We also now know that pregnant women with type 1 increase their beta cell production while they're pregnant. So this notion that the beta cell is a lost soul once the autoimmune attack starts is wrong. That's an important thing that we've discovered. And what it's led us to is realizing that a major focus of curing this disease has to be on looking at ways to restore beta cell health and survival. And we're doing just that. There are multiple human clinical trials going on right now with drugs and compounds that appear to have a positive effect on beta cell health and survival. Gleevec is a leukemia drug. It's a cancer drug, and when they were testing it for cancer, somebody noticed, oh, it actually seems to have an interesting effect on beta cells, but that's not what they were looking at. They didn't care. It was a cancer drug. We've taken Gleevec into human clinical trials, people with type 1 diabetes, and in the first stage of the trial, about 20 or 30 patients, it had a positive effect on beta cell health and survival, meaning it increased the health and survival of beta cells in people with type 1 diabetes. Think about that. That's a big deal. Verapamil is a blood pressure drug. University of Alabama, it's been out for decades. University of Alabama, Birmingham tested verapamil initially on mice. This slide is really out of date. Earlier this year, they announced the preliminary results of a clinical trial of verapamil on type 1s. And they also found that this drug was having an effect on protecting beta cell health and survival and reducing the need for external insulin. TUDCA is yet another compound where we're seeing, and I can go on, there's half a dozen of these at least. So we're seeing right now today as we speak, and Gleevec and verapamil are now going to enroll more patients, because in clinical trials you start with very few, and then if it works you get more, and then you get a lot more. That's the sequence of how you get it. Usually there are 3 stages of clinical trials before you present your data to FDA to get it approved. So we're seeing significant and exciting opportunity and potential in this area of keeping beta cells healthy and survival. Then you've got to stop the immune attack. This is a huge and complicated issue, but I will tell you, see this sort of little kind of cool thing, which is like a balanced seesaw. That's what we're going for. Normal immune balance, all right? And here again, we have several human clinical trials going on of different types of drugs that are showing potential in helping to regulate the autoimmune attack and slow it down. And we're going to test and continue to test these, and we're looking at more and more opportunities. So when we think again about curing type 1, we're thinking of this combination of therapies on the immune system, And I'm going to talk, when I talk about prevention, about vaccines, which very related to this, and then restoring beta cell health and survival. By the way, there's other ways that we might get beta cells in, because it's not just working on the beta cells that might be still in the pancreas. There are potentially ways that we're looking at through gene editing techniques. We've got work going on right now. There are other pancreatic cells, by the way, that you may have heard of. There's something called an alpha cell, not just a beta cell. We've actually had success in reprogramming alpha cells to be beta cells in mice. So the idea there is maybe we can trick the immune system by programming a cell to behave like a beta cell, but the body thinks it's an alpha cell, even though it's behaving like a beta cell. This is early stuff, but again, a lot of pretty interesting, exciting stuff going on in this area. I'm going to talk about beta cell replacement now for a few minutes. We used to call this just beta cell encapsulation. You may have heard it at different talks. And the idea of encapsulated beta cells is the idea of imagine a case like this, although much, much smaller, filled with beta cells. Beta cells that are derived in different ways. They might be derived from pigs. But let's say you've got a packet and it's got a barrier around it, a semi-permeable barrier, so things can get out and get in. What do you want to get in? So now you take this barrier, you put the cells in it, and you implant it in somebody with type 1 diabetes. Outpatient procedure. You go in, you get it in. What happens, and is happening, and we'll get into this in more detail, is that you have the beta cells in there, and the bloods and the oxygen in your body can keep the beta cells healthy and nurtured so they can function, and they integrate into the blood system. So when the body needs insulin, the beta cell can release the insulin through the capsule into the bloodstream. But the T cells, the T attacking cells, the T effector cells as they're called, they actually are too big. Not all body cells are the same size, so the insulin molecule can get out, but the attacking T cell can't get into those protected beta cells. So that's a simple concept. A capsule with a protective barrier keeps the immune attack out, but allows the beta cells to function. And in the way we envision this working, you'd go into the doctor's office, you'd get that implant, you'd leave, and for hopefully, eventually, as we envision the long-term evolution of this kind of product, you'll be able to go 12 to 18 months without thinking about type 1 diabetes. This capsule will do all the work. No blood count, sugar testing, no carb counting, no finger pricks, no nothing. And then 12 months, 18 months, you go back to the doctor, they take that one out, put another one in, off you go for another 12 to 18 months. You talk to my daughter, and she'll say, you know, Dad, I'm all for the cure. Yeah, I want this thing out of my body. But you get me an encapsulated beta cell product, and I don't have to think about this for 12 months at a time, and then I just have to go in and get another one? That's a cure. That's my cure. Now, we know it's not a biological cure, but I'm pretty sure anybody with type 1 in this room wouldn't quibble over whether it's technically a cure or not. That's what beta cell replacement therapies are about. And it's not science fiction. Right now, there are multiple companies doing human clinical trials with different types of encapsulated beta cell devices. Later, I'm going to have a breakout session, I think. We're going to talk a little bit more detail about this because it can get very, very nerdy. And just so I'm transparent, I got a C- in biology in 9th grade and a D in chemistry and never took another science class to my everlasting regret. So I'm not really in the nerdy part of this. But the point is, there are people in human trials right now with encapsulated beta cell devices being tested. There are big companies. Listen to this. We funded a company called Remember I talked about leverage, right? We funded a company called Sigalon. It's actually a company that came out of MIT. One of the greatest biomaterial scientists in the world, received awards from countries and governments, including our government, for his work in biomaterials. Works out of MIT. He founded a company, and we're funding him to come up with what's the good material for the capsule. Because that's a big deal, right? It's got to work, it's got to sit inside the body, it can't trigger an immune response. There's lots of complexity to doing this right. What's the size of it? What's the design of it? So Sigalon and Langer, who's a guy at MIT, had never done any work in type 1 diabetes, ever. Never. We kind of came to him and he said, this is a cool problem. He put his lab to work on it. He formed a company called Sigalon because they started identifying promising compounds. And earlier this year, Sigalon entered into a partnership with the drug giant Eli Lilly to further advance the beta cell therapy stage. We are now seeing big pharma come in to beta cell replacement. It would not happen if we didn't de-risk this space. Novo Nordisk is all in on developing a beta cell replacement product. Other big companies, Sanofi, another company working in this space, and I could go on. Some of these are in trials, some of these are still in development. There's a lot we still need to figure out about this stuff, but it's the single thing in our research portfolio that I'm most excited about. I think it's where artificial pancreas systems were 8 years ago. This is not happening tomorrow. I wish it were. Believe me, I do. And I'm as impatient as anybody in this room to get it there. But, you know, when we started the artificial pancreas project, which we'll talk about a little bit, people thought that was pretty crazy. And in 10 years, we went from no work on artificial pancreas to the Medtronic 670G being approved. Another thing that would not have happened without JDRF, by the way. So this is moving. And there are a lot of problems to solve, but they're scientific problems. And we believe that they're solvable problems. And we have a consortium of about 50 scientists from around the world who meet twice a year under our umbrella to try to figure out how do we solve the problems or the challenges, not the problems, the challenges that you always have in scientific research to kind of move forward a beta cell replacement device. And there's not a single, I was up there in Boston when we met in May, there's not a single person in that consortium who doesn't think we're going to be able to deliver a beta cell replacement therapy in the not too distant future. We talk about prevention, and you know, you've seen our slogans, you know, a world without type 1 diabetes, right? Well, what's a world without type 1 diabetes if we only stop it or treat it for those of you who already have it? You know, prevention hit home for me because initially I was like, don't spend $1 of my money on prevention. My kid already has it. So I want you to fix her. That was my mindset. Pretty selfish, I admit it. Well, when my older daughter, who doesn't have type 1, was pregnant with her first child, I happened to be with Emma. We were in California. My old daughter lived in New York at the time. And we got a phone call from my daughter, and there was a potential very, very, very serious problem with her pregnancy that might result in the end of the pregnancy. So we were all kind of course, traumatized. And I was out walking with Emma, and she turns to me and she says, you know, Dad, if that baby has type 1 diabetes, I'm going to kill myself. And we all know she didn't mean it literally, but she was going to blame herself if her niece or nephew had type 1. And I thought, oh my God, that's, I mean, after the tears stopped, that's prevention to me. I'm about to have a grandchild. I don't want this in my family anymore. I don't want anybody to get it. I don't want anybody in your families to get it. We have to prevent type 1 diabetes. We have to not just cure it, we have to prevent it so nobody has to go through what the people in this room have to go through living with this disease. And that's why we have a prevention program, because the reality is, and you have TrialNet out there. I saw a booth from TrialNet. TrialNet, as you probably know, TrialNet is an organization where you can get your antibodies tested from those people in the family who don't have type 1 to see if they have the antibodies for type 1. And the reality is, if you have 2 of the 3 antibodies for type 1 diabetes that we've identified, you will get type 1 diabetes. And we can talk about whether it's something you want to know or you don't want to know, and there's an interesting conversation to have around that. But prevention is a huge part of our portfolio, and it's an important part of our portfolio. You can see here, we touched on this earlier, this is the incidence of young people with type 1 diabetes. It's projected to triple by 2050. To triple. That's just in the United States. On a global basis, this disease is exploding, as are a lot of other autoimmune diseases, particularly in developed countries. So we've got a screening program that we're beginning. We've funded screening programs. In Germany, this one on the right, Frida, was done in the state of Bavaria in Germany, and they screened every child in the state of Bavaria under the age of 3, I believe, for type 1 diabetes. First time it had ever been done in kind of a population-based screening. Now you say, well, what good is screening them if we can't stop it? Well, I'll tell you what good it is. First of all, what they found in this study is if you can identify people at risk, we can reduce the rate of diabetic ketoacidosis dramatically. Diabetic ketoacidosis, DKA, is the biggest killer in type 1 diabetes. No, I am not. If we can reduce the incidence of DKA, we can save a lot of people. But we also are finding that when you find people at risk, we're actually looking for ways through our different kinds of programs that we're funding to have interventions that stretch out that honeymoon period, that push out as far as we can the point at which you're insulin dependent, 100% insulin dependent. Screening is a very big part, of course, of prevention. The ASK program, which is just launched in Colorado, is the first population-based screening program for type 1 diabetes anywhere in the United States. It's actually also going to be screening for celiac disease, which has some real interesting overlap with type 1. But this is a big deal, and it leads, again, the other point is not just the DKAs, but we're finding in the data that when you identify at-risk people and you are aware that they're at risk, it's actually resulting in much better A1Cs when they actually start to become symptomatic and need insulin. There's a lot of stuff going on in prevention. I'm going to hit and run on some of these things because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. I mentioned vaccines. You see antiviral vaccine up there. Polio is something called an enterovirus. It's a virus. It's a form of a virus. We have a vaccine that's essentially wiped out polio. Not everywhere, but mostly we've cured polio. We know that there's a virus associated with type 1 diabetes called the Coxsackie-B virus, which has been identified with somewhere, some people say as much as 50% of type 1 diabetes cases. Some people think that's too high. But we know it's a factor. And we have a company that we're funding through our T1D fund that is trying to develop a Coxsackie-B antiviral vaccine for type 1 diabetes. There are other kinds of vaccines we're trying to develop, antigen-specific. Does anybody have allergies and get allergy shots? Okay, well, yes? Okay. Well, if you get allergy shots, you're getting antigen-specific vaccines. You're getting a little tiny amount of what you're allergic to train your immune system to tolerate it. That's all an allergy shot is. We're looking at whether we can train the immune system in the type 1 diabetes space by targeting the antigens that we know are associated with type 1 diabetes in the same way you would do it for allergies. This thing about gut bacteria down here, microbiome, we now know the microbiome, the gut, filled with billions and billions of forms of bacteria. And we think of bacteria as bad guys, but bacteria actually is how you set the immune system. Very early in life, the gut, the microbiome, is where your immune system is regulated. And we know from research we funded that in people with type 1, something's gone wrong in the microbiome, in the gut bacteria, at a very early age, perhaps even before birth in some people. And so we're now funding a great deal of research to try to understand exactly what's going on in that microbiome, because if we can begin to sort of identify what's happening in people with type 1 that causes that microbiome to dysfunction, maybe there's an intervention very early on that we can do to restore the microbiome's ability to properly regulate the immune system for type 1 diabetes. So we've talked about curing the disease and beta cell replacement. We've talked about prevention. But we still, as I said, we've got to keep people healthy. Those are all things that are coming down the pike, but they're not coming tomorrow. I wish I could stand here and tell you there's going to be a cure in 5 years, but I can't and I won't. I don't know whether it's going to be 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. I have no idea. This is tough stuff we're doing. It's exciting, the work we're doing. It's extraordinarily promising and hopeful. But the reality is science is tough. There are ups and downs. And we're trying to do something, as I said, nobody's done. So how do we do? What do we have to do? We have to keep everybody healthy, whether it's for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, or 20 years. We've got to keep them healthy. And what this tells you is most people with type 1 diabetes are not doing well. This tells you down here, if you look at these different lines, the columns here are ages, 2 to 5, 6 to 12, 13 to 17, and 50 plus. And the yellow line is the incidence of hypoglycemia and DKA, and the green one is DKA. And this is telling you that there's still a very high incidence in people with type 1 of severe hypoglycemia, which we know is pretty scary stuff. We also know that most people with type 1 are well over a A1C of 7. It just is. This is tough work. The younger you are, the harder it is. Okay? Tell the kids in the audience who are, in their, teens and even younger. Every day is different. I remember when Emma would come home and we'd all be dancing in our kitchen because she was 80 in the morning and 100 at lunchtime and 110 when she came home and 80 at dinner time and 105 at bedtime. It was like, what a great day. We've got this. And what happens the next day? She wakes up at 250, she goes to 400, then she falls to 30. What happened? We did everything the same, right? This is hard work, and so we've got to make it easier. And of course, everybody knows about the artificial pancreas system. We're now actually starting to refer to these as automated insulin delivery systems. But as I said earlier, these would not exist without JDRF. I'm not going to get into more detail other than to tell you nobody was working on this when JDRF launched its artificial pancreas project. Nobody in the industry thought this was worth their time or their money. And we turned that around. And we now have the Medtronic 670G, the first one on the market. And let me tell you something about that system. In the human clinical trial data submitted to the FDA to get the FDA to approve the 670G, I'm going to tell you 3 things about what that data said. First, it reduced the average A1C score of the people in the trial by 0.5 point. That's an average. Some people did a lot better than that, some people not as well. But if you started the trial at 7, you ended up at 6.5. If you started it at 8, you ended up at 7.5 on average. 74% of the time, people in the trial's blood sugar was between 80 and 180. 3/4 of every day. Now, we know that's not perfect, but again, I'll go around the room and ask anybody with type 1 if you could be sure 3/4 of every day you'd be between 70 and 180, 80 and 180. You'd be pretty damn happy with that. That's pretty good. That's what they had on this trial. And lastly, this device was worn for 12,000 hours by people in the clinical trial. There was not a single severe hypoglycemic event. Not one severe hypoglycemic event in 12,000 patient hours. And that's a first generation system. That's the first one, okay? Remember these things? Remember the first cell phone you ever saw? It's like that, right? Sat on a table. That's what's going to happen with this stuff. There are a bunch of companies in this space, Insulet's out there. They've got a artificial pancreas automated insulin delivery system that's gone through partially through human trials. Bigfoot, run by a former CEO of JDRF, he's working on an automated insulin system. Tandem is going to probably go to the FDA early next year or middle of next year for their low glucose suspend artificial pancreas system approval. Beta Bionics, Type 0. This is cool. Dexcom. Who's got a Dexcom? It's a CGM company, right? No, they just bought Type 0. Dexcom is going to get in the artificial pancreas and automated insulin delivery system space. Why is all that important? Why do we need more than one company? It's great to have Medtronic in this space. Reality is competition breeds innovation. This is really exciting stuff. I'm not going to spend more time on it. We're funding efforts to miniaturize these systems. My daughter will not wear the Medtronic or many of the other devices that are in development because she doesn't want to wear that many devices. She says, get it down to one, Dad. I'll think about it. Well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make them smaller and less invasive. And we've also got the effort going on to actually have the do-it-yourself market, because actually a lot of people developed hacked artificial pancreas systems. And we're now working with a lot of the companies to try to create an open protocol standard for that space as well. So there's other work we're doing in the glucose control space that I actually took out of this slide deck because I didn't want to run out of time, but we're working on different kinds of drug therapies. There's a company called Lexicon that we funded that's going to get approval this year from the FDA, we expect, to introduce a type 1 diabetes drug that in clinical trials has been shown to significantly improve glucose control in people with type 1, has some impact on weight loss and lowering blood pressure. That is virtually certain to get approved by the FDA. That's going to be the first diabetes drug in history that is going to the FDA to get approved for type 1 before type 2. And that'll be on the market, and that's a drug that we help fund. There's a lot of other stuff going on. I'm happy in the Q&A to talk about those. We've talked a lot about advocacy, so I'm not going to beat this horse any more than I did and Steve did earlier, other than to reiterate the work of this advocacy program in terms of practical effect on your life. The research program, we know this stuff takes time. It's frustrating, it's annoying, we're impatient, but science is tough, it's a slog. We all know that. This program, almost every year or two, it's doing something to impact your life. Elderly people on Medicare who couldn't get CGMs a year ago, now Medicare covers CGMs. There we go. That's because of JDRF. So that's the advocacy program at work, and Steve touched on a number of the other ways as I did. You know, I'm gonna tell you a joke, which kind of, I think, tells you where I think we are. Sherlock Holmes and Watson were on a camping trip. And Holmes wakes Watson up in the middle of the night and he shakes him and he says, "Watson, look up in the sky and tell me what you see." And Watson now goes, "I'm going to really impress the great deductive reasoner Holmes, the great detective." So he looks up in the sky and he says, "Well, Holmes, I could see that horologically it's 3 o'clock in the morning." And Holmes says, "Well, great, Watson, what else do you see?" He looks up again and he says, "Well, I can see that meteorologically we're going to have a beautiful day tomorrow." And Holmes says, "Yeah, Watson, what else do you see?" He's starting to get a little frustrated. Watson he looks up again and he says, "Well, I can see that astrologically Leo is in Saturn." And now Holmes is getting completely exasperated. He says, "Watson, what else do you see?" And Watson goes for the big finish. He looks up there and he says, "Astronomically, I can see that there are billions and billions of stars and the universe is filled with infinite possibility." And he turns to Holmes feeling, I'm going to get the big pat on the back, and he says, "What do you see, Holmes?" And Holmes says, "Watson, you idiot, some son of a gun stole our tent." I like the joke. It doesn't have a lot to do with type 1 diabetes, but I like infinite possibility. That's where we are today. We are living in a time of infinite possibility. 10 years ago, I could not have stood up here and told you that. I really wouldn't have. But any scientist in the type 1 diabetes space will tell you this is a golden age for research, and I've just scratched the surface. We talked about immunology. Has anybody been reading about cancer? Drugs that target the immune system in cancer? The guy leading the biggest research project in cancer immunological research, Jeffrey Bluestone, was funded by JDRF for years in looking at the immune issues associated with type 1 diabetes. He's now working on this cancer project. He will tell you that he believes that the work in cancer immunology will directly impact the work we're doing and need to do in type 1. He believes the two will eventually merge. And listen to this. This is fascinating. There are people who are getting cancer immune therapies who are seeing cancers go in remission. But fascinatingly high, not a huge percentage of them, after they get the immune therapy, are developing type 1 diabetes. So if you don't think there may be a connection There's a connection. So all that money going into cancer immunology, that's going to help us too. So this all gets put together in a pot, and the times have never been more exciting. The possibilities have never been greater. It's why I said at the beginning that I am more optimistic than I was when I knew nothing, and they just told us there'd be a cure in 5 years. I believe my daughter will not live with this disease her whole life. I believe that along the way to curing it, she will be able to live without thinking about this disease and will have a completely healthy and normal life over time, free of the risk of complications from type 1 diabetes. I don't know whether that's in 5 years or 10 years. I believe it because I see where the science is going. I talk to the scientists, and it's an incredibly exciting time, as I said, filled with infinite possibilities. My message to you all is this. Whether you fundraise for JDRF, whether you walk, whether you ride, whether you're an advocate, whether you volunteer in the office, whatever you do, it matters. It helps. We are pushing the boundaries of medical research. We are making progress. We are going to change lives. We are changing lives. And the future has never been brighter. Again, nobody is as impatient as I am. Nobody is as impatient as virtually everybody on our board has a connection to type 1 diabetes. So we are in this with you. So thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take as many questions as we have time for on any topic that I've touched on or not touched on, and thanks for coming out. Yeah.
Got to ask you about the current state and specifically the cost of insulin.
Yeah.
And what impact JDRF is able to have.
Yeah. Great question. Well, you heard about the coverage to control program that Steve mentioned. That's a major effort that we have focused at insurance companies. We're meeting one-on-one with every insurance company on the issues around insulin pricing. We've been in the Congress and around the Hill talking to members of Congress and in the FDA and in the Trump administration about this. You know, the whole issue around drug pricing, any drug pricing, is bigger than us. As if you follow this, I mean, I'm not trying to say that we don't have a role to play, but the system itself is extraordinarily complicated and extraordinarily messy. But we are very intensively focused through our health policy program in not only generating data around the issues around insulin pricing and insulin access, by the way, which is a big problem also. And if we lose pre-existing conditions, there are going to be people who will die from type 1 diabetes because they're not going to be able to get the drugs that they need. So my answer is it's a jawboning exercise. It's one-on-one with insurance companies. And we're going to keep at it, and you know, we're monitoring it pretty closely. We're looking to see that rebates, you know, in the system of drug pricing, there's a rebate system that occurs between the manufacturers and what they call the pharmacy benefit managers, who are between the drug company and your let's say you work for a big company. The big company, you know, Corporation XYZ, has a pharmacy benefit manager that actually administers a lot of their drug stuff. There's rebates that pass back and forth between these. We're trying to get those rebates to go to the consumer. That's the big direction of our push, and we're working one-on-one. And I think if we can get one to break, the dam will break. But we're working at it. But it's tough. I mean, I wish I had a better answer for you than we're working at it. But we are, and I remember a couple of years ago, we had a conference call about this, and some people said, well, you know, insulin prices, it's sort of not research, and some of us said, yeah, no, it isn't research, and you could argue that it's not exactly what we're here for, but it's the single most important thing to people who live with this disease, and we can't be on the sidelines. And so we've gotten into the game, and hopefully we're going to continue to be able to have some impact. Yeah. Any other questions? Come on. Yeah.
I type 1 70 years of type 1, and I have been to Boston on the research really does make a difference. And JDRF has done a marvelous job. The research that you referred to is, I'm proud of it. I've been back there 3 times.
Are you a medalist? Is that what are you a medalist?
This is the 50-year medal. I got it 20 years ago. And but the point I'm trying to make is that you can live well. I was just telling my neighbor Jack what I do at the gym, and I pushed 35,000 pounds in weights last Thursday. That's the most I've ever done, and that was more than I did when I was younger. So you can live well, do everything you want to do, raise your families, and live a normal life.
You know, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah.
Emma went to Africa about 3 or 4 years ago, to Namibia, which is a magnificent country and has an extraordinary desert, a very remote desert, and of course that's where she was going. And people said to me, aren't you worried if something happens to her there? And I thought, I should be, but I'm not. And they said, well, why not? I said, well, you know, I believe that if something happened when she was over there, and she went skydiving over there, and I said, you know, I could call you and say, my daughter needs somebody, and you'd call somebody else, who'd call somebody else, who'd call somebody else, and after some amount of phone calls, 5 of them, 10 of them, maybe 20 of them, somebody who never heard of me or my daughter all the way over in Namibia would drop everything they were doing and go help her. Just like if I got a call from any of you when you were in Washington or something, or you had somebody in Washington, and you said, I can't track down my daughter, I remember you spoke at this thing, so I had your number, I don't have anybody to turn to, I can't get in touch with my loved one, can you help? What would I do? I'd get out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'd put on my clothes and I'd go help. That's what we do in this community. That is what we do. That is the power of all of you in this room, collectively with every one of the other folks just like you and me all around the country. That's why I am so hopeful. That's why I'm so confident. It is that kind of attitude that you just heard, and it's the attitude that people bring to this organization. Everybody always says this is a club none of us wanted to be in. But I will tell you, I've met some of the most amazing people that are going to be friends for the rest of our lives long after Emma isn't dealing with type 1 diabetes. It's an extraordinary group of people. It's a passionate group. It's a relentless group. It's a committed group. And it is a we will stop at nothing until we succeed group. So, yeah. Any other questions? Really? No other questions?
I think they'll have time for one more.
All right.
Hey guys, I'm Ramon. So my daughter was diagnosed with type 1 back in January. I'm sure as all you guys can understand, it's a struggle, right? But based on the research that I've learned, like, I understand like the last 10 years, there's been a spike for children developing type 1. I'm wondering to see if yourself or anyone here knows what the cause of this unusual spike.
Well, it's a great question. You know, if everybody hear the question, it's sort of why has there been a spike in type 1 diabetes in the last decade? And I've briefly alluded to that. It's actually a spike in autoimmune diseases. I mean, I don't know about you, but I never heard of celiac 15 years ago. Now celiac's a big disease. Gluten issues, that's actually an autoimmune condition as well. So it's a big problem on a global basis. And one of the things we're pretty sure is going on with it, although there's a lot of work, that NIH program, Special Diabetes Program, is funding a global, what they call a longitudinal study, which collects data over many, many, many years. I think they've got over 40 or 50,000 people now into the database, where the big part of that research is trying to understand causes of type 1 diabetes. And we're learning a lot as we go. But one of the things that's definitely happening is there's a lot of viral triggers in the environment now. People who have no family history of type 1 are seeing type 1 come in out of the blue, and that's virtually certainly related, not entirely all the time, to viral triggers. It's fascinating when you go to third world countries or less developed countries, the incidence of autoimmune disease is much less. And there's a theory, and it's more than a theory, I think it's pretty much accepted in scientific circles, called the hygiene hypothesis. which is that in societies like ours, what did I do when I came, right before I came over here? Actually, when I got on the airplane this morning to fly out here, I used Purell on my hands. All right? Actually, that may make me feel better that I'm not getting germs, but every time you do that, you're actually compromising your immune system a little bit. Every time you take antibiotics, you're compromising your immune system. In this culture that we live in a lot of the developed countries, we live in this sort of antiseptic-free society, and our body's not actually being exposed to bacteria in the way that allows it to tolerate it. There's research about people who grew up on farms in Germany who have much lower incidences of autoimmune diseases than people who grew up in the cities in Germany. So I wouldn't put that out as the definitive only reason, but it's certainly part of it. There are probably things around vitamin deficiencies that we're learning more about, still nothing dispositive. Again, interesting research. We talked about the microbiome, what's going wrong there. There's research that shows that using probiotics in infants in the first 6 months of life might be a protector against type 1. Again, not something you could count on because we don't have enough data. But it's a great question, and it's something we really need to understand more, and there's a lot of work being done on a global basis to understand it. Thanks for the question. All right, I think they're going to make me leave. So, but thank you very much again for your time, and